For my project on human trafficking, I chose the two states, Kansas and Wisconsin. Um, so, just to kind of talk about the comprehensive list of state trafficking statutes, Kansas human trafficking is, I'll just list a couple. I've got them all listed on the PowerPoint. We'll just go over a couple of them. Expect as provided in subsection the international recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, and obtaining of a person for labor or services through use of force, fraud, and for the purpose of subjecting the person to involuntary servitude or forced labor. Another one, intentionally benefiting financially or by receiving anything by value from participation in a venture that the person has the reason to know has engaged in facts set forth in subsection A1. So, causing or threatening to cause physical injury to any person, physical restraining or threatening to physically restrain another person, abusing or threatening to abuse the law or legal process, threatening to withhold food, lodging, or clothing, knowingly destroying, concealing, removing, or possessing any actual or government identification documents of another person, knowingly holding another person in conditions that is not satisfying for debt owed by the person, aggravated human trafficking, involving the commission or attempted commission of kidnapping as defined, human trafficking as defined, combined in a whole or in part for purpose of sexual gratification of the dependent or the defendant or another. Human trafficking as defined in subsection resulting in death. This is still Kansas. And when it comes to children, hiring a child by giving or offering or agreeing to give anything of value to another person to engage in manual or other bodily contact stimulation of the genitals of another person with the intent to arouse or gratify the sexual desire of the offender or another. Human trafficking is a severity level 2 person felony. So we'll go on next and talk about a little bit of Wisconsin's sex trafficking. Any sexual contact, sexual intercourse, sexual explicit performance, any other conduct done for the purpose of sexual humiliation, arousal and gratification. Debt bondage means the condition of a debtor arising from the debtor's pledge of services as security for debt services. Between Kansas and Wisconsin, there are several similarities in the statutes as far as the sexual intercourse or the service or keeping them from clothes, food, water, any of that. To debt, both of them are talking about debt. And trafficking, definition in Wisconsin is means recruiting, harboring, transporting, providing, obtaining, or attempting to recruit, entice, harbor, um, stuff like that. So one of the followings applies. It's a Class D felony in Wisconsin. Um, the trafficking is for the purpose of labor services. Trafficking is for the purpose of commercial sex act. The trafficking is done by any of the following: causing or threatening to cause bodily harm to an individual, causing or threatening financial harm to any individual, restraining or threatening to restrain any individual, violating or threatening to violate a law, destroying, concealing, removing, possessing, threatening to destroy, removing, um, any of that is also part of that Class D felony. Extortion, fraud, debt bondage, controlling or threatening to control any individual's access to an addictive controlled substance, using or threatening to use violence on an individual, causing or threatening to cause any individual to do any act against an individual. Individual's will without the individual's consent. So, like intercourse or any kind of sexual contact. So, relevant substatutes for Kansas, it was Statute 3 talked about causing or threatening to cause physical injury to any person, physically restraining or threatening to physically retain another person, abusing and threatening to abuse the law or the legal process, knowingly destroy, concealing, removing, possessing any actual or purported government identification documents of another person. For Wisconsin, it's Statute 2, causing or threatening to cause bodily harm or bodily harm to any individual, restraining or threatening to restrain any individual, violating or threatening to violate a law, destroying, removing, concealing, possessing, threatening to destroy, any of that sort. The literal description for Kansas is human trafficking includes recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, for the purpose of subjecting the person to involuntary servitude or forced labor. For Wisconsin, its trafficking means recruiting, enticing, harboring, transporting, providing, obtaining an individual without consent of the individual or attempting to do any of the same. So they're very similar definitions, as you can see. So how are they similar? Like I've talked about, a lot of the statutes are the same on what's considered human trafficking and what's not considered human trafficking. Except for the only difference that I noticed was I felt like Kansas's was more broad. It talked in depth about every statute to the extent where if it's anything remotely close to human trafficking, you're probably going to get charged in Kansas because their laws are so drawn out compared to Wisconsin. I didn't find, there was a lot of statutes on human trafficking, but it wasn't to the extent that Kansas's statutes were. What's missing? I noticed on Kansas statute 2, intentionally benefiting financially or by receiving anything of value from participation in a venture that the person has reason to know has engaged in the act set forth in subsection. Subsection. It's talked about benefiting financially from trafficking that person. what I recall, I don't see that in Wisconsin's in their statutes. Um, I may have not went down that far on the statute list, but I've got quite a bit of the statutes on my presentation, and I could not find that. So that was what I noticed, what was missing, and what I could recommend to put it on there. And that's my presentation. Thank you for listening.